Hey, I'm Smooneychad, and this is Modded Kerbal Space Program, and today we have an incredibly challenging mission, sending a VTOL plane all the way to the surface of Eve, and maybe even visiting Gilly along the way. And I've got to do all of that using aircraft only. We're going to pick up exactly where we left off in the last episode, where I showed you that I had around 1,200 science to spend, and we're going to go ahead and spend some of that, and grab some things that are going to make life a lot easier. And I really want to get this node right here that has some gigantic jet engines, some of these from some of the mods that we've added, and of course some cargo bays and some hinges, since we're going to be needing a lot of this stuff for the mission I've got planned today. First up, we're going to start building that plane that we're going to be sending to Eve, since everything else kind of needs to be built around getting this thing to the surface of Eve. And this is going to be very simple, just a probe plane, and I was going to try to make it as simple as possible, but as you'll see, as the development continues, things keep getting more and more complicated on me. You can see there that I'm adding some hinges to this, and then adding the elevon parts there, and that's going to be the wings, and of course they're going to be swing wings, and that's only simply because we need to fold this thing up into a cargo bay, and be able to unfold those later when we actually land on Eve. It also helps about shifting the center of mass and center of lift around for different scenarios, so it's going to be handy pretty much overall. And here you can see I'm just setting up the propellers for this, and I went with just 2 propellers to begin with, and all I did there was just deploy them and then set the deploy angle to 0, and then I bound that deploy angle to one of my throttles on my flight controller. And you can bind that to the main throttle and just use shift and control to control that. It really helps with squeezing the top speed out of any aircraft. We've got this out on the runway though, and immediately there are some problems. The little landing legs that I was going to use as skids and just land this thing on skids, since I figured it would be some pretty slow speed landings. Yeah, those weren't working, so I replaced them with some big hefty landing gear. And although I was able to counter the torque from the prop a little bit better and finally get this thing off the ground, it was pretty clear that the mix between the heavy landing gear and only having 2 props on there, yeah, this thing wasn't going to get anywhere really fast and probably just hit the ground again. So I went back to the drawing board with this and came up with a little bit more of a complicated direction for it, but hopefully a much lighter and much more reliable design. Basically adding a second motor and some landing legs on the bottom and making this a VTOL. So completely by necessity and not by design choice or anything like that, this has became a swing wing VTOL. Seems like usually whenever I design something that's either VTOL or swing wing, it's solely just for the cool factor and not really for any practical purpose, but this is kind of the opposite. I intended for it to be an incredibly simple little plane, but ended up making it incredibly complicated and a swing wing VTOL in the end. So I think that's pretty cool, just solely based on the mission requirements. And I have to admit that this ended up coming out looking a lot like some sort of weapon. Like, it looks like a flying bomb. It's also basically the exact same core design at the center that I used for stock missiles and bombs, so do with the information what you will. Here you can see the control room getting ready for the first official test flight of this with some design improvements and everything. This is the probe control room mod, and it is absolutely amazing. If you put cameras on your probes like I have on this, you can fly them from the view of the camera and get some awesome statistics and stuff, like you're in here actually controlling it from a distance. That's super, super neat, but we're going to be using a lot of third person mixed in with this, of course, because I doubt you want to see an entire mission flown from this. If you do, let me know though. The goal of this first test flight is to fly all the way over to the island runway and see if this thing can actually sustain flight for a long period of time using just the solar power on board, which is just 2 tiny little solar panels on there. And the only reason we can get away with that is because I've got the output power on those motors heavily reduced, since we don't need the entire power of the motors. We're also going to be testing the landing, which is a very sketchy process. We're going to be flipping up vertically when we come in for landing, extending the legs, then bleeding off all of our forward velocity, and then coming in for a nice soft landing. Now we've got to be able to do this reliably a lot on the surface of Eve to be able to hop from biome to biome, getting as much science as we can from this thing. And to add to the reliability problem, yeah, this thing has a pretty high center of mass, so it wants to pretty much tip over the second that you land. Something that can help out with it, though, is actually lowering the swing wings. It lowers our center of gravity, and we're able to land safely. So we made a few little extra modifications to this, painted it a nice color of military green just to add to the weapon effect, and now we're going to get started on the plane that's going to carry it to Eve. This plane is going to spend most of its time outside of atmospheres, just floating around in space, and I took some creative liberties with it. It didn't need as many wings as what I ended up putting on it, since they're only really there for re-entering when this thing is like dead empty, and maybe helping out the carrier craft, because this thing is going to be going on top of yet another aircraft whenever I'm done with it. Yes, this mission has a whole 3 layers of aircraft to it. The carrier aircraft, this parasite aircraft, and then the payload aircraft inside of this one that's actually going to go to Eve. Unlike the KSP2 series, where I used a lot of probes and satellite buses and things like that to get things to where I needed them to be, I'm really taking the aircraft-only aspect of this dead serious. But now we're going to begin construction of the actual carrier aircraft, which more or less needs to be an SSTO itself. We're very close to it. And that there was actually my solution to not having the Mark III rocket fuel tanks. I'm just taking the Mark III payload bays and cramming them with regular rocket fuel tanks. And I'm also going to be adding some huge engines that I've never tried out before on this. Those are the Arcadia engines from, I believe it's Near Future Aeronautics mod. And we're going to be seeing if that actually works for an SSTO engine or not, or, you know, close to an SSTO engine. The idea here is to get the aircraft that we're about to mount on the back of this one as close to low Kerbin orbit as we can possibly get it. And with that, we're basically done with the carrier aircraft, and we're ready to stack everything together for the very first time, and it's aircraft all the way down. Inside the payload bay there going to Eve, we have the SO8 Wasp. Carrying it, we have the SO9 Cole, and then carrying that, we have the SO10 Tawaki. And if you're curious about my naming scheme, it's pretty simple. The SO number is just the number of aircraft that I've built. So the SO10 is just the 10th aircraft that I've built. Then the name is based on birds or insects if it's under 10 tons. So it's pretty simple. You may have noticed while I was talking that I squeezed in a tiny little relay satellite there next to the Wasp, and that's just so we can communicate with it even after Jebs went home. Here we are out on the launch pad though, and we're ready to test out those Arcadia engines and see if they have enough get up and go to get this thing into low Kerbin orbit, or very close to it, like I said. And it turns out that, yeah, they didn't really work out the way that I thought they would. We couldn't even get over supersonic with 2 of them, so I figured that 3 might get us just over the edge and get us to enough thrust to get supersonic, which it kind of did, but it still just wasn't what I was looking for with this carrier aircraft. We also had a problem with it tilting once we activated the rocket engines there. So we went back to the drawing board and replaced those engines with the good old faithful Panther engines. 12 of them to be exact. So 12 afterburning Panther engines instead of those 2 or 3 Arcadia engines that we had before. We also replaced the rocket engines in the middle there with swivel engines just to help a little bit with balancing the thrust out. And this thing has a lot of power now, like a lot of power. If we switch this over to being an SSTO rather than just a carrier aircraft like it is right now, I would say it would probably get like at least 10 tons into low Kerbin orbit, which is pretty good for a Panther SSTO, I'd say. Here we are activating those 8 swivel engines at about 800 meters per second, 14 kilometers up. And yeah, this worked out really, really well, and it was nearly an SSTO by itself with that 24-ton, 25-ton, something like that, aircraft on top of it. So that's really, really good. And here's just a race to get to orbit as quick as possible before the Tawaki back there, the carrier aircraft, falls back into the atmosphere and we can't switch to it. Now don't worry, I had a backup for this if we didn't get into orbit, which we did. We managed to get Jeb into a pretty good circular orbit before this thing started actually hitting atmosphere again. The backup was FMRS, I believe it's called, which has custom save points and would have let us bring this thing back regardless. But I'm glad that we actually got to do this in like the stock save system without any save mods or anything. And you can see this thing, even though it was in the like 20-kilometer range or something like that, was keeping up with the aircraft it brought up to orbit, which is pretty insane how fast it was going on and how easily it was hanging on to its velocity. You can see there in the map view I chose landing at round range, which I had not went to before. Valentina is evidently very excited about it. She must know something that I don't know about round range. But we fly out there, and I'm getting comfortable with using atmospheric autopilot to fly right now. And oh my god, what a difference atmospheric autopilot makes when you activate it. is so smooth. You can probably go back there and watch the approach that I made to round range here. It was so incredibly smooth flying out to it. It was a little bit scary though, landing it in the dark. I just had the little twinkle of the lights there at the runway to go on, and it's pretty much in the mountains and stuff, so it was a bit weird to land at. It was a bit terrifying to land at. And here we are with our 60-ton aircraft right here, trying to make it stop halfway down the runway, which we activated the drogue chute, which is an eensy tiny little thing. I should have like added two at least. It looks so goofy whenever it activated, like this little tiny parachute's just slowing this huge plane down. Luckily we did get it slowed down though, and got a look at round range too. Very cool little airport, very cool place. Back up in orbit, Jeb is checking out his payload, making sure that everything survived the ascent to orbit, and, you know, just pressing buttons and playing around with all of the screens here. Yeah, he's pretty much wasting time up there, and he's going to have to waste a lot of time because, as usual, I completely forgot about launch windows, and according to AstroGator here, it's going to take 370 days of Jeb floating around in orbit before we're at the next EVE launch window. And we're going to go ahead and use AstroGator to make that maneuver node for us. It's a very handy mod. It's probably not the most efficient maneuver nodes at all. If you're trying to go for like really efficient transfers between planets and stuff, I probably wouldn't recommend using this and just setting up your own maneuver nodes and everything, but it's really handy if you want to just save time and you have extra Delta V. Like, I'm the guy who packs 4,000 Delta V to go to Misc and back. I don't really ever worry about that stuff. I always pack extra, so it's okay for me. It's also very helpful for like far outer planets and stuff like that, or just any planets that don't usually have transfer windows readily available online for you to figure them out or anything like that. It's a big time saver. Here we are at EVE though, and I'm not going to be doing an air brake pass. One, because I air braked too much already, and two, because he's coming in at nearly 5,000 meters per second. And yeah, EVE will eat this aircraft. The cockpit there, it has a very low heat tolerance, and it tends to melt off with that kind of stuff. We're going to go into a very eccentric orbit though, and go ahead and release our relay set. In retrospect, this was a pretty big mistake because the little tiny antenna on the back of the WASP there can't actually communicate with the relay satellite all the way out at its apoapsis. So I should have brought that down to a lower orbit, though it would have took more fuel for that. Here we are releasing the WASP though. We went ahead and brought our periapsis down into the atmosphere, enough for the WASP to be able to deorbit, and then we're going to kick that back up so that the coal there doesn't burn and die with Jeb inside of it. But we have a problem. We can't communicate with Kerbin. Yeah, even though we're out here with the 5G relay satellite, the tracking station needed an upgrade before we were able to communicate all the way out here, since by the time we got here, we were pretty far away from Kerbin. Luckily, though, we got everything sorted out, and it was time to land the WASP on EVE. And this was a very spicy re-entry. I had to do several tries trying to get the right periapsis for this to deorbit in one run, because we needed to stay in communication with that satellite up there, the relay one, the entire descent, which of course a plasma blackout here stopped our communication, but we really needed that communication to pick back up once the plasma was gone away, because this has no parachutes. We're going to land this completely just using the power of the props alone, just like we did at the island runway on Kerbin, which was the last time that I tested landing this thing. Yeah, this was never actually tested on EVE before landing it here. I just assumed that it would be basically the exact same. Well, so we'll see how that turns out. And the reason I didn't use any parachutes on this was because, well, parachutes are cheating if you're using only aircraft. I feel like this thing can fly, so why not fly it down to the ground? We unswung our wings there, and another win for swing wings. It actually stopped us from flipping around whenever we were in time warp because it moved our center of lift around. Here we are going through the very first cloud deck, which was absolutely beautiful, but I don't think I was prepared for the next cloud deck, which was even more beautiful. This little gap between the clouds here is just amazing. It looks even better in person. I don't know why. Like, that sounds weird because it's a video game, but it does. It didn't look as good on video as it did to experience it there. EVE with EVE volumetric clouds is absolutely amazing. One problem though, the clouds almost come all the way down to the ground. So it's kind of hard to judge your landing. So this took a few tries, and a few tries is probably a vast understatement. This took a lot of tries, and we were going into the probe control room here to check the ground. For some reason, I just kind of see the ground better whenever we are using the landing cam here in probe control room. I'm still getting used to using it, but I'm so glad we have this mod. It is really, really cool giving an IVA mission control to all of your probe missions like this. It's really, really neat. And as you can see, it's really useful. I can pull up a bunch of different data about the craft, and it looks nice in the process. We're going to go over here and fly to a more flat location this time, because on the very, very many failed landings that we had, it was kind of slipping around on the surface, because we do have the bare minimum of landing legs on this, and they are the weakest landing legs. If you don't count those really tiny ones that one of the mods that we have adds in, these are pretty much the weakest landing legs. And you may notice that I was kind of hovering here, and that's because it was basically take off or fall at like 3 meters per second. There was no in between because of how thick the atmosphere is on Eve. I believe it's 6 times thicker than Kerbin. And we were helped out by sliding by those nice parallax rocks there. I actually just recently turned on collision for those, and I had no idea that it actually would have came back and helped me a little bit. We're going to go ahead and do the only 2 science experiments that we have, which is just the barometer and thermometer, which, yeah, that's the only 2 ones that we could reuse over and over again, and we're small enough to go on this thing. But we're going to go ahead and transmit the data that we collected back to Kerbin, and the crowd goes wild. We actually got some data back from this thing, and we're going to immediately take it back off and head over to another biome. There should be plenty of biomes around here. I have basically no idea where we landed at. I tried using the coordinates and Kerbal maps, or what's left of Kerbal maps, to try to figure out, but I think I ended up getting the location completely wrong. Nevertheless, I ended up heading directly south because that seemed to be the most promising from any map that I looked at to get some more biomes. So we flew down this hillside here. We are at a pretty high altitude here. Right now we've got it on the altitude above the ground, but I think it was like close to like 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters up or something like that. So we're at a pretty high altitude for Eve, which I guess makes sense because we were in the peaks biome there. And now we flew down the side out of those clouds into the classic purple Eve surface in a somewhat flat area that looks like it would be great to land at. We're in a different biome now, so we're going to try to get some samples here and see what everything looks like. We're going to go ahead and actually fly up to 500 meters here to get a quick save, which is that's the height you need to go to above the ground anywhere to get a quick save, I'm pretty sure, because it doesn't allow you below that and says you're going to crash. There's probably a mod for that. I hope there's a mod for that. If there is a mod for that, I'll probably add it. We nailed the landing, though. It was just sliding down the hill, by the way, so we had to take right back off and go find a better place. Luckily, we did get our samples, though, and we're able to transmit some stuff. And I went ahead and turned on the lights there because they look kind of cool. And yeah, it's pretty dark under here. Even though our solar panels are technically getting more power, enough power to fly and charge them, actually. Though this was on a lower like power setting with the propellers there and with the wings deployed down for more lift. But we were able to charge while we were flying, which is pretty darn promising for taking this thing on longer trips. Here I'm going to try out landing again in the flattest spot yet, I promise. And I'm actually trying out a new way of recording here to smooth out the camera and everything. Let me know if you like this, because I am pretty darn jumpy with the camera, and given this is some classic 5 FPS gameplay here on the Aircraft Only series, the camera can get pretty hectic. And once we send all of that data back, I would consider this a pretty big success, and in the future we can take off from this location and go explore other biomes around Eve, and there's a lot more to explore. But for right now, we're going to go back to Jeb, and we're going to try to squeeze every last bit of science out of Eve that we can. We're going to take him down to low Eve orbit here, closer to Eve, and do a whole bunch of EVA walks over and over again as we pass over each new biome, basically farming the EVA reports over and over again like we always do. And then I'm going to go back up to the apoapsis and actually have him dip just like 500 meters into Eve's upper atmosphere, and we're going to do a whole new round of science there. And I'm actually going to get him out while we're flying through the very, very top of the atmosphere here, just the tiniest top of the atmosphere, like literally, like I think it's just 700 meters down into the atmosphere right here. We're going to have him actually get out on a spacewalk and then get back in. And I'm actually kind of disappointed that that doesn't count for more science than what it does, because that is incredibly dangerous right there. Getting out of your spacecraft while you're basically re-entering. But now we're going to be going on that promised trip to Gilly, and I'm basically going to be tracking it down like you would a spacecraft. You want to rendezvous with Gilly rather than get an encounter with Gilly, and that's the exact approach I took. I just moved my orbit around until I got an encounter with Gilly, and then just burned there to catch up with it and more or less rendezvous with it. You can really go the rendezvous route, but yeah, I just got an encounter with it and then matched its orbit there. You're doing all the work at Gilly. There's no gravitational help here, and we're just going to go ahead and kill all of our speed here pretty high above the surface, and then get Jeb out and do a bunch of signs on the way down, and then get him back in. Yeah, we're falling very slowly, so yeah, it's no big deal. I've just got the center Terrier engine there activated, and I'm just slowly bringing this down to the surface, and we land on a massive rock pile there, which looks really amazing, by the way. Parallax does some wonders for this. And yeah, we're just going to get out here and put a flag on top of one of these rocks. God knows the flag will probably like float away. It's Gilly after all, so don't count on that being there anytime soon. But there's our little aircraft only branding for Gilly, and then we're going to go ahead and get back in and hopefully head all the way back to Kerbin. Though, yeah, we're getting pretty close on Delta V now. Well, pretty close as far as I'm concerned. I tried using Astrogator again to get a nice encounter, but ended up just setting up the encounter with Kerbin myself, and we had to wait quite a while floating around Eve here at the same orbit as Gilly before we made our little burn out to Kerbin. Well, it wasn't that little of a burn. It left us with around 400 meters per second of Delta V once we got to Kerbin, which is plenty enough to get captured with without doing any crazy air braking or anything like that. It's pretty much become the bane of my existence, aero braking, so I'm glad whenever I have enough Delta V to just capture normally. I still am going to have to do it, though, because I need to lower our orbit down to a nice circular orbit before we actually come down and land at some runway somewhere. Luckily, that is a pretty painless process once you're in orbit with the newer generation of the planes in this series. They now have reaction wheels or RCS, or a mixture between the two, and they're a lot easier to control in the re-entry phase. So we're going to be coming down here after quite a few braking passes and everything at Sandy Island, of course, which lined up pretty much perfectly with our orbit, and this is a controlled spin, by the way. This was completely on purpose. It genuinely was, and we got control of ourselves here and began the descent down to Sandy Island, which we nearly passed up. I had quite a bit of trouble actually lining up the descent here, because trajectories does no good with space planes, really. It does good if you're using a pod or something like that, or landing a rocket or something like that. It's okay, but your plane's aerodynamics can really change on re-entry depending on the angle and everything like that. So it's not as useful. And we're coming in for a really weird landing here. I actually landed before the runway, and that's because I didn't really test this thing out any. I just trusted the aerodynamics of it. And yeah, I maybe should have dropped it a few times from a high altitude before I tested it out. Oh my god, look how hot the cockpit got there. Jeb is still almost burning alive here on the runway. So we're going to go ahead and recover that before he spontaneously combusts. And we found out that we got over 2,000 sides to play around with in total, which is pretty darn crazy. And Jeb gained 31 XP, putting him at level 4 now. Naturally, I head over to the R&D center, but I'm not actually able to buy the engines that I would like to get out of this. And we don't have enough money to upgrade the R&D center, so in the next episode, we might just have to focus on money. That's all I've got for today, though. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this one. It took a little bit longer to produce than the other episodes, but I had a ton of fun flying this mission and designing the crafts. Thank you so much for watching. This is Smooneychad, out.